Even if Gen Y do have preferred learning styles that are different to previous generations, it is not necessarily the case that they will prefer different delivery approaches from the past. For example, using a visual, oral, read-write, kinesthetic and multimodal learning style inventory, VARC, Becker, Kehoe and Tennant found that learning styles do not appear to influence students' overall preference for flexible delivery methods and assessment approaches. A further assumption that underpins calls for major change in education is that Gen Y possess the technical skills to use the technology. The research shows that such a generalization is not entirely unproblematic. For example, as part of his justification for his proposition that students are clamouring for these technologies to be used as part of their education, Prensky states that this is in part because they are things that the students have already mastered and use in their daily lives, and in part because they realise just how useful they are. Here, Prensky makes two major errors. Firstly, he makes a broad generalization about the access to technology across populations. Secondly, he makes the broad assumption that if students use technology for private and social purposes, that they will also want to use these technologies to support learning. Based on a survey of more than 2,000 incoming students at the University of Melbourne, Kennedy et al. 2007 showed that in Australia there is almost universal access to mobile phones, desktop computers, and approximately 2/3 or more of Generation Y have unrestricted access to digital camera, memory stick, MP3 player, and a laptop computer. Approximately 3/4 have unrestricted access to broadband internet. When one considers that Australia is a wealthy country and that university students can be seen as an elite, such access rates are not surprising. However, a recent survey of 7,400 primary and secondary school students in Australia flags the dangers of a digital divide even with a country as wealthy as Australia, in finding that ICT literacy proficiency is lower amongst students from low socio-economic status, Indigenous backgrounds and remote locations. Now let us turn to how frequently young people use technology. In conducting a broad-based survey of the frequency of use of computers, the web and mobile technologies, Kennedy et al. Conclude that the majority of respondents possess a core set of basic technology skills, but there is a lack of homogeneity with a diverse range of skills across the population. And even where core skills exist, they do not necessarily translate into sophisticated skills with other technologies or general information literacy. In relation to primary and secondary school students, similar conclusions have been drawn from a national assessment of ICT literacy of 7,400 students across Australia. Using predefined benchmarks of performance against the characteristics of ICT literacy for Year 6 and Year 10 students, the study concluded that one should not assume that students are uniformly becoming adept because they use ICT so widely in their daily lives. The results of the assessment survey suggest that students use ICT in a relatively limited way, and this is reflected in the overall level of ICT literacy. If we now turn to the assumption that Generation Y will have the metacognitive skills to use technology to support e-learning, there are two perspectives to consider. Firstly, the adaptation of technology use from social or private purposes to formal learning, and secondly, whether Gen Y are likely to have developed the general metacognitive repertoire required to support learning. In the first case, the transfer from social or entertainment technology to a learning technology is neither automatic nor guaranteed. Technology plays different roles in personal and educational contexts, and we cannot assume that members of Generation Y know how to employ technology-based tools strategically to optimize learning. In the second case, a survey of the literature on readiness for e-learning suggests that, to be successful, students require learner self-efficacy, self-management and self-directedness, comfort with and motivation towards online learning, and the required technical skills. These characteristics become problematic as research into 17 to 24-year-olds suggests that this group prefer surface learning directive but supportive learning, and relational rather than abstract thinking. In respect to Year 6 and Year 10 students, the Mukherjee report on ICT literacy concludes that the results of the assessment survey suggest that students use ICT in a relatively limited way, and this is reflected in the overall level of ICT literacy. Communications with peers and using the internet to look up information are frequent applications, but there is much less frequent use of applications that involve creating, analysing or transforming information. Whilst further research is required and these findings are not conclusive, they do not provide a high level of confidence for the success of e-learning if adequate support is not provided. Generation 2 activity theory is concerned for the environment in which the activity occurs. This leads us to consider the community, rules and division of labour. Whilst dealt with more briefly and selectively than the preceding subject, object and tool categories, they are considered to provide a sense of how Generation 2 activity theory can be used to provide a holistic approach to an evaluation of Gen Y and e-learning. In regard to community, given that this paper focuses on government-sponsored education, it's reasonable to assume that government is a key stakeholder in all sectors of education. In addition, parents, teachers and students are major stakeholders in primary and secondary education. Industry is also likely to have an interest where secondary education leans towards training for work. Industry teachers and students are primary stakeholders in post-compulsory technical and vocational education and university education. Across all sectors, commercial interests associated with the development, installation and maintenance of e-learning technology are also likely to consider that they have a legitimate investment in education system generally. In regard to rules, education, particularly that which is government regulated, is subject to a range of explicit and implicit rules and regulations. Rules might be associated with legal, financial, moral, ethical, social or cultural considerations. In a complete analysis, the rules associated with all stakeholders and between all stakeholders need to be considered. Some rules are formalised into government acts, laws or regulations. Others are less formalised. In a general sense, formalised rules often relate to who can provide educational services, what resources are provided and what outcomes are required. This may be represented in agreements and also in curriculum documents. More obvious rules relate to attempts to minimise potential risks to the safety of students who may be exposed to illegal or inappropriate content, bullying or other inappropriate behaviours, as well as minimising potential risks to educational organisations such as disputes over the ownership of copyright materials. There are also rules that are more implicit. For example, learners may develop unspoken conventions about who has access to what technologies and how these technologies are used. Division of labour addresses the question who does what and what are the relationships. For example, in many educational institutions, government sets broad policy for education, providers interpret those directions and develop management plans within the available resources and required outcomes. In large educational institutions, there is often an information technology department that installs and maintains infrastructure. Teachers have traditionally been responsible for implementation of the curriculum and students are expected to learn. To conclude, this presentation has used the framework of activity theory to examine some of the assumptions that underpin the promotion of e-learning to support the learning experiences of Gen Y. This examination has been conducted with the aim of providing a constructive contribution to the discussions about Gen Y and e-learning. Whilst I've been critical of assumptions that underpin many of the simplistic and unproven arguments for the promotion of e-learning, I have done this with the aim of opening rather than closing the discussion. Education is not a neutral activity. It's heavily influenced by socio-cultural heritage and by political interests. I'm proposing and hope that I've convinced you that activity theory provides a way of unpacking a complex issue so that crude simplifications that meet the purposes of specific interest groups can be made explicit and considered.